Putin's direct line is always an extraordinary show. And for the past few weeks, it's combined. You have the direct line combined with a press conference. For the direct line, it's amazing. This year, he received over 2 million questions, mostly from Russia, of course, but from all over the world as well. So it was an absolutely outstanding show. 4.5 hours. He spoke virtually non-stop, answering all sorts of questions, domestic, foreign policy, for even personal questions, for 4.5 hours, and some questions from the media who were there as well. It was quite interesting because I sent my question via email. And in fact, he answered it indirectly in the middle of one of his answers. My question was very simple. Did Russia suffer a strategic defeat in Syria? And basically Putin said, no, Russia has not been weakened by what happened in Syria. Of course, there are lots of nuances in his response, and the whole way he treated the Syrian episode and the connections with Turkey, Israel, and of course, how we came to the situation since Russia intervened in Syria in 2015. It was quite intriguing. Some of the answers on foreign policy, they were fascinating, but what they did not reveal, especially, and for what was implied. For instance, he was extremely diplomatic dealing with Turkey. Instead of basically getting into the heart of the whole matter, which is Erdogan's obsession with his neo-Ottomanist policies. In fact, in the column that I just wrote before I start talking to you and to our audience, it's with Sputnik, probably is going to come out later today or tonight in Russia. One of my intertitles is Erdogan is thinking about 1919, which is not as far-fetched that many people would think. He's actually thinking about what happened to the Ottoman Empire after the end of the First World War, all the promises that were there, and the lands that he considered that they are part of Turkey, which in his own words, earlier this week, Greater Turkey is much bigger than Turkey itself. This is what he said. And obviously, everybody interpreted as, yes, he's going to annex Syrian territory, which he is already doing. But in his mind, Danny, it's fascinating. Thessaloniki, Cyprus, Aleppo, and even Mosul are included in this Greater Turkey, according to his 1919 interpretation. So Putin was extremely diplomatic. He didn't get into it. He said, they have problems with the Kurds, but now this can be solved because they are policing their southern borders. I just hope there's not going to be any further problems about all that. There will be. And Putin knows better than anyone. But he didn't get into it. At the same time, what he said about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the new authorities in Syria was extremely revealing. He actually said that, yes, we are talking. And it's not back channels, it's direct channels. We're going to try to find positions in common. And this brings us to a very, very thorny question. This means that Russia is now talking with Salafi jihadi terrorists directly. And this is not exactly a Russia's official position vis-a-vis terrorism, especially until a few days ago when Russia was fighting Salafi jihadi terror in Syria and elsewhere. So this proves that in terms of realpolitik, that's how it works, especially when you have a big power involved. Okay, the whole situation has changed. Irrespective of the deals, and we can say there is a lot of secret deals that were made. Among the three of the Astana process, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And until the last minute at that round table Saturday in Doha, before the fall of Damascus on Sunday, and the deals struck between Turkey and Israel and Russia and Israel. So obviously Putin was extremely circumspect, talking about this, basically a big power gameplay. But what he said about Israel, he went up a notch. So this was also quite significant. If he was insisting on a dialogue with the new authorities in Syria, his own words, in terms of Russia's strategic priority, also his own definition, keeping the bases in Haimin and Tartus. These are the Russian priorities. So they have to talk with the new authorities in Syria, which are not the real authorities. The authority is Turkey. So he was implying that he's talking to Erdogan. And they are talking all the time. Back channels, phone calls that are not leaked, etc. Israel, he said at least three things that are quite significant. That Israel is the main beneficiary of what's happening in Syria. And you can read that in terms of the big picture. That he's not exactly sure what are Israel's long-term objectives in Gaza, which led him to condemning what's happening in Gaza, the genocide, without mentioning the word genocide, the term genocide. And he also condemned the annexation of land, stealing, annexation, invasion, annexation of Syria land by Israel. So this went up a notch. And obviously this will be, considering how powerful is the Zionist lobby in Moscow, there will be repercussions about that. At the same time, which is also very, very interesting, and this comes from our Moscow connections, there was a fateful, long phone call, Putin and Netanyahu. And guess what happened immediately afterwards? Israel started bombing every warehouse in the book and off the book containing Soviet and Russian weapons all across Syria. The big question, Danny, who gave these coordinates? And then we enter mega fog of war mystery. Nobody knows. I'm sure you have seen that a lot of people are blaming Assad for that. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Assad did, especially Assad giving coordinates to Israel. Forget it. So this came, we can say, with a certain degree of certainty from sources in Russia. If they are from the Minister of Defense, affiliated with the Minister of Defense, if they are from intel agencies, factions inside the intel agencies, nobody knows. And if anybody says that they know, they're lying. So just this short introduction gives you and our audience a little bit of how extremely murky the situation is and how, in many aspects, Putin's answers were evasive. They were very, very cleverly articulated. They left everything up in the air, except for this straight condemnation of Israel. Everything in terms of Turkey and Russia was up in the air. And of course, the fact that they are talking directly with Jolani and obviously with Erdogan about the future of Tartus and Haimin. So let's say this is our introduction to how complex the whole situation is. And we're not even talking about what he said about Ukraine.
Well, before we get to that, I wanted to ask you what you make of the reports about Russia possibly leaving Syria as we speak and moving their military assets to Libya. Is there any truth to this? Because
yes,
because I've heard different things, so I'm curious about your assessment.
Fog of war again, Danny. They are moving assets to Libya. No question. They may move some of these assets back to Russia. No question. And of course, we still don't know what's going to happen to Hmyimim and Tartus, because this ultimately, this is a direct negotiation between Erdogan and Putin. Considering that they are on very good speaking terms, no matter what happened before, and that comes back to all this fog of war about what kind of pre-fall of Damascus deal was struck between specifically Ankara and Moscow. Nobody knows for sure the terms of this deal. Obviously, there is a deal. There are two very good reasons already for it. Nothing happened with the Russian embassy in Damascus, number one, which is being protected, by the way, by HTS. That's quite something. Protecting from, obviously, more exalted Salafi jihadis, which may have other ideas, right? And the bases are still there. And the planes are coming and going. Transport planes are coming and going. And when it comes to transportation of Russian assets, many of these flights are overflying Turkish airspace. So this is a direct, a combination between at the highest level. All right, but we don't know the terms, and we'll probably will never know in I would say short to medium term. Same thing with Israel. We still don't know exactly what were the terms, even though Putin strongly condemned what Israel is doing in southern Syria. But what he did not say, which I thought was particularly interesting as well, was Iran and Russia, which would be inbuilt in that question of if Iran was weakened by what happened in Syria, if Russia was weakened by what happened in Syria, Iran was also weakened by what happened in Syria. He didn't answer anything about that, and nobody asked him about this, unfortunately, among the media that was there. And obviously, once again, we had a stupid question from NBC. That guy is beyond stupid. Everybody knows him in Moscow. And Rosenberg from the BBC, which is another asshole. The usual stupid questions. And this was an extremely important question, Iran-Russia, especially because next month, 5 days after Trump comes to power, they're going to sign the strategic partnership, Russia and Iran, and in Moscow, with Pezeshkian and Putin signing the agreement. So this is extremely important. It's still up in the air. What the thing about the pre-deals before the fall of Damascus makes sense because there's no especially because there's no manifest antagonism between Erdogan and Putin so far. But everything else, Danny, is fog of war territory.
Well, let's return to West Asia in a minute. I wanted to, however, ask you about what you thought about Vladimir Putin's comments regarding the Oreshnik, because during this direct line media, he challenged NATO directly around the capabilities of the Oreshnik versus their air defense systems. This is what he had to say.
That was beautiful.
There is no chance to shoot down these Oreshnik missiles. Well, if those Western experts you mentioned think so, that Oreshnik can be shot down, we suggest they, and those in the West and the United States, who pay them for their analysis, conduct some kind of technological experiment, a high-tech duel of the 21st century. Let them name some object, let's say in Kiev, concentrate all their air defense and missile defense forces there, and we will hit it with Oreshnik and see what happens.
So that's what Vladimir Putin had to say. And
I loved it. You know what I saw, Danny, when he said that? I had the good, the bad, and the ugly in my head with the final shootout with Clint Eastwood. and he rewrote it for the 21st century as a high-tech duel. That was brilliant. That was brilliant. I'm sure he thought about this trolling before. He didn't come up with that at the spur of the moment. Obviously, he thought about it before. And the way he delivered in a deadpan manner was even better. It was perfect. Knowing, first of all, that this is never going to happen, number one. And number two, if it ever happened, the humiliation of all these NATO-stunned idiots would be larger than the actual current humiliation they are suffering in the black soil of Novorossiya. So he felt free to spell it out. And obviously, this proves that, first of all, the West will never understand what Oreshnik is all about. One of the good explanations about Oreshnik lately has been Dmitry Orlov's explanation, which is physics and mathematics, essentially. And obviously, all these guys who run policy from Washington to Brussels, they are less than zero in both physics and mathematics. So they will never understand the Oreshnik principle. Not to mention that the Russians are working on other systems similar to Oreshnik or even more hardcore than Oreshnik. So let's say this was a little bit of, I wouldn't say comic relief, but considering some of the questions and the answers were so heavy, this was playful Putin in action.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Pepe, because Russia did just conduct what they call a long-range precision strike on Kiev, and I'm curious, did they use the Oreshnik here or not?
Apparently not. No, apparently not. As far as we know so far, no. It was some sort of ICBM. We still don't know what. And, little problem. They could have hit this design center and the SBU command center. Come on, over a year ago, 2 years ago. Why now? Why wait so long? And this is not me saying it. This is what you hear in Moscow, in many circles, especially circles close to the Siloviki, the intel agencies, the people who are in favor of going for the head of the snake for a long time, and they think that Putin is too moderate, and he is. But there is a serious backlash. And after the killing of General Kirillov, that continues. He had no protection, Danny. Can you imagine that he leaves his house in the morning? There's not even a guard in front of his apartment. It's absurd. It's totally absurd. Just as before they killed Daria Dugina, Dugin had no protection at all. He has protection now, but that's after the fact. It's ridiculous. Kirillov, which is one of the most important actors in the whole unmasking of everything that the Pentagon has been doing in terms of biolabs, not only in Ukraine, but everywhere. Nothing, absolutely nothing. So there are serious problems in Russia in terms of lax security procedures. And a lot of people who don't need protection, they actually enjoy it. So that's serious. And when you touch this subject in Moscow, this is very, very touchy. It depends on how you frame it, especially if you're a foreigner. You have to be very careful. But this backlash against too many velvet gloves dealing with everything coming from those literally neo-Nazis in Kiev, But it's complicated because it involves the Ministry of Defense, layers at the Ministry of Defense, different layers in the intel agencies, the discussions between Putin and the Security Council, what other people in the Security Council do to influence Putin's policies. It's very, very, very complex, So for outsiders to say blah, 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 it's basically blah, blah, blah. They don't know shit, in fact. And when we are there in Moscow and we see, for instance, inside ministries, the serious fiefdoms inside ministries, we see how complex the problem is. And when it comes to the Ministry of Defense, it's even more complicated because the Ministry of Defense is like a fortress. And it's impregnable for practically everyone, except insiders in the Ministry of Defense.
Yeah. What do you believe Russia's response to this will be then? Because it appears that we've had reports from U.S. intel saying that Russia will use the Oreshnik again. And then we just had Igor Kirillov be assassinated on Russian soil in Moscow. What do you believe the response will be to this? Because it appears that as we go into January 20th, 2025, the changing administration in the United States, it seems like the United States and NATO are upping the ante in terms of escalating this conflict.
Well, NATO keep escalating. The only thing that NATO does is to escalate. We know that. And this window is very, very, we have this window of 1 month, roughly. This is probably the most dangerous months that, in recent history. Really, anything could happen. False flag. This thing could derail in a flash. We know it. First of all, because they're desperate. When I say they, is the exiting crash test dummy administration. And they only have 1 month to produce some facts on the ground that could alter, I would say, the flow of history, which shows an absolutely humiliating defeat, strategic defeat of NATO across the spectrum in Novorossiya. You cannot alter this fact, and this fact is practically inevitable. It's ahead of us, could be in the next few months, could be before the end of 2025 maximum, but it's inevitable. And there's nothing they can do to alter this fact apart from a direct intervention, which we all know what it means. And they're cowards, essentially. They won't do it. They're cowards. The only thing that they do is provocation. The strategy of the empire, and our friend Michael Hudson was one of the best interpreters, still is chaos, is anarchy. I used this in my last column before the one that I wrote today. And I quoted Michael. The American project essentially is anarchy. And now they installed total anarchy in West Asia. Nobody knows what will come out of having a crypto emir of Damascus controlled by Turkish intel and military intel sitting in thesis as the new emir of Syria. And all these repercussions are everywhere with all the players. So that's perfect in terms of an anarchic scenario. In Ukraine, the only thing that they can do, that the cornered empire can do, is provoke more chaos and more anarchy. But they are dealing directly with a nuclear superpower and hypersonic superpower. It's a completely different story. Syria was a practically non-government at the end. And the way the Syrian Arab army dissolved was, so many factors led to it. We cannot blame the soldiers of the Syrian Arab army. The country had been starved, literally, practically to death for almost 14 years. So it was a tsunami of sanctions, a state of siege, leading to starvation, almost mass starvation, an army that was not equipped, an army that said, okay, we did everything after that deal that they struck in 2020, and Salafi jihadis were more or less in that cage in greater Idlibistan. They said, this thing is over. No, of course not. And of course, the Iranians and the Russians do that. And when they start warning Assad, look, this thing is going to explode this past few months, so we went through it, since June by Ayatollah Khamenei, Russians, Iranians, everything, So it was inevitable that this was happening in Syria. In Ukraine, it's a completely different story. The Russians are controlling everything. The Russians control the battlefield. The Russians control up to where they're going to take the battlefield. The Russians control when we decide to end the story. And once again, Putin, during the Q&A, he was so diplomatic when he talked about the possible end of the war in Ukraine. He outlined the basic contours, but in a very soft way. He basically came back to Istanbul in 2022. Istanbul does not apply anymore because the conditions in the battlefield are completely different. You cannot go back to what they practically clinched in Istanbul at the time. No. And obviously when NATO is a side player. When the American generals and the Pentagon, they look at the state of the battlefield and what Russia could say, look, these are our conditions, they freak out completely. Because then it's total humiliating defeat and they cannot escape it. But Putin still said, okay, we come back to, what was agreed in Istanbul and all that. We need a legitimate government in Kiev, which they know it's not going to happen. Putin actually said, if Zelensky calls for elections and becomes a legitimate leader of Ukraine, we'll discuss with him. Putin knows that, first, Zelensky is not going to call elections. Second, he is already illegitimate. And third, he will lose the elections if he calls them. So, it's a vicious circle. Who they're going to discuss with about the future. And of course, Putin also said, we only sign deals if there is a legitimate leader in Ukraine. Once again, very important. It's not a legitimate leader in Ukraine that is going to decide anything and sign anything. Putin knows more than anybody that it's the American president. And coming back to Lavrov has been talking about this for months, over a year, in fact. The US is a non-agreement capable superpower. So basically, there are several ways to interpret why Putin was so accommodating when talking about a possible resolution for Ukraine. Okay, this was, let's say, an exercise in public relations, the Q&A. So he couldn't get too deep into it. So he left, once again, everything up in the air, right? And being very accommodating. But we know by what he's been saying for the past few months, by what Medvedev has been saying, by what is filtered through Peskov and all that, that the Russian conditions are those conditions spelled out since June. And they're very, very strict. And they know that the Americans will never accept any of that. But that's it. That's it. And that's not going to change, Danny and all of you. So the question becomes, after January 20, what is Trump's margin of maneuver? And what margin of maneuver the deep state will give him to negotiate? It's not him. He cannot negotiate anything. He can negotiate maybe an MMA fight with a Dagestan wrestler in Madison Square Garden, but he cannot solve the war in Ukraine.
Right. And Vladimir Putin was very clear saying that Russia is in the driver's seat, that the military is taking entire square kilometers with each passing day in Ukraine. So the question remains then, given all of this, how do you see Russia playing out the rest of this conflict moving into the Trump administration? Because right now, what it seems Vladimir Putin is saying is that it's all full steam ahead. Yes. And you have this dynamic, too, of Vladimir Putin talking, as you said, more moderately, Dmitry Medvedev talking more maybe radically, we could say, in terms of responses to these red lines being crossed. Where do you see all of this falling? Somewhere in the middle, or are we going to see more of the same coming up?
I'll answer your question, Danny, next month. I'll be back in Russia by the end of January. And this is one of my key questions everywhere, apart from the not exactly answered question about strategic defeat in Syria. Well, in 1 month, the situation, a month and a half, the situation in Syria is going to evolve very, very fast. But on Ukraine, we're going to have a pretty good idea of where things are going after a few days of the Trump administration in place. So, I would say late January until mid-February, we're going to have a pretty good idea where this is going. There will probably be a phone call, right? At least one phone call, direct phone call. Maybe they'll set up a meeting. So far, I would say for all of us, we have to be on red alert on what might go horribly wrong during the next 4 weeks.
Which could be, I mean, what could we be expecting in the next 4 weeks? Because I definitely understand the sentiment given what we have seen thus far, the increasing escalation, strikes on Russian territory, assassinations of major military figures in Russia. What could be next?
A provocation in Moscow, much bigger than killing General Kirillov. I would say that this is the number one possibility because the SBU can do that with their NATO advisors. They can easily do it. And then all bets are off. Because you cannot say, we're going to respond, this is a red line. No. Then all bets are really off. So we have reason to be extremely worried, all of us. Mm-hmm. And these people are out of control, Danny, we know. And the exiting bunch before January 20, they are mega losers. They lost everything. They lost all their bets, except, of course, Syria. But Syria is a long story because Syria is bipartisan. It's different. Mm-hmm. Syria is the deep state. For the moment, the deep state won in Syria. We don't know for how long. But what started with Operation Timber Sycamore, all of you remember, I'm sure, which was basically do everything to destroy Assad. And then the Pentagon took over later on, and this preparation of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was basically directed by the Pentagon. Which, by the way, they have 2,000 troops in Syria, right, Danny? We didn't know that. They just revealed to us a few days ago. We have at least 2,000 troops in Syria, which means they probably have 10,000.
Yeah, well, that number was far lower, in terms of public reporting.
Exactly.
When it comes to that. Yeah.
So this tactical victory, of course, but when you look at this, since the beginning of the war, for 13 and something years, it will have to happen because Syria was practically totally destroyed. It had to happen. Starved to death, everything, the sanctions, corruption, and of course the last few weeks, Samsonites full of cash, you name it. It was inevitable. And coming back to Assad, I'm not sure he will talk in public after this first declaration. We didn't explain much. No? Maybe Russia wants to keep him in the background for a while, see where this is going. Because don't forget, he could come back later, in a few years, for instance. Anything is possible. And considering that the Russians are always a few steps ahead, chess-wise, anything is possible. I am particularly intrigued by the Spetsnaz in person with some of their best operatives, snatching General Hussein al-Hassan and bring him to Moscow. And, as I wrote it today, it's not to put him in a comfortable dacha in front of the Lake Baikal. No. He's going to be talking business. and long-term business. So this is far from over. It's just beginning. And of course, Russia has, in terms of discussing, especially with Turkey, what they want, probably the only leader that Erdogan really listens to in the world is Putin. He doesn't listen to anybody else. And the only one that he really respects. So the margin of maneuver is enormous, which comes back to all these pre-fall of Damascus secret deals, which we'll never know about, of course. But the interest, I would say that the really, really interesting link is what Erdogan and Putin more or less established. Next steps ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm curious if you could talk a bit about that, given the writings that you have just published, which I can share with folks in the video description directly, as you're speaking. I wanted to ask you about, you've written a couple of articles, one for The Cradle, one for Strategic Culture, about this situation, and you did comment on Russia's role, how Russia's navigating this, but so much more, which I want to get into. So first, maybe talk about that, and then we can move on to some of the other points you made in the article.
Well, the key point is what we've been discussing from the beginning, what Erdogan and Putin decided behind closed doors. And this was personal, Danny. You remember Lavrov's body language at the table in Doha on Saturday when he was with Hakan Fidan from Turkey and Arakshi from Iran? Lavrov was pissed. I've never seen him like this, especially during this past year, for instance, because he knew that the deal was done and he was not fully aware of what this was all about. So this was not discussed at the level of foreign ministers, was high up. There's a fascinating photo, which is, it's a riot in Turkey. You have the three neo-Ottomans, one behind the other. You have Erdogan close up, right behind him, Hakan Fidan, which was the former head of MIT, Turkish Intel. And right behind Fidan is Kalin, which is the current head of MIT, Turkish Intel. So this is, you see the neo-Ottoman triumvirate in one picture. In Russia, you could never have a photo like this. You would be only Putin. You would have what? Gerasimov as number two. No, Gerasimov doesn't make policy. So this was Putin and Erdogan directly. And like I told you, Danny will never know. This is really up there. I will try to get some more into it, and I'm going to Istanbul before I go to Moscow next month. So I hope some people in Istanbul can at least, especially dissidents, well-informed dissidents, can tell us a little bit extra from what they are gathering, not from the pro-AKP press and pro-Erdogan press, different, but from some, relatively independent players who have access to Ankara, to the palace in Ankara. And there are some, and they're outside the government, but they have their connections still. Usually diplomats, well-connected diplomats. So
Right.
it is in geopolitical terms, in terms of cliffhangers, it's what's going on is absolutely fascinating. And for all of us observers, it's total fog of war. We know what happened in Syria and how. We have no idea what could happen next.
Well, in our remaining time, I wanted to now pivot, because in your pieces that you've been writing about Syria, you have gone into great lengths as to the state of the overall axis of resistance. And unlike others in our circles, perhaps we could say,
Yes.
who are very pessimistic about the situation going forward, you offer not just the obvious realism and realistic situation that there is the difficulties and challenges right now and ahead for the resistance for the multipolar world, but you also say not so fast about the axis of resistance being dead. We just saw Yemen strike Israel with 2 ballistic missiles. They obviously didn't get the memo that the axis of resistance is dead.
No,
but so I'm curious about if you could lay out how you are looking at this overall situation in the region and in the multipolar world as the fallout from Syria's collapse takes shape.
Well, Danny, what's going on in Tehran, once again, it's very, very complicated. There is a power struggle, no question. Let's I'm oversimplifying essentially, but let's say on one side, leader Ayatollah Khamenei and the IRGC leadership, and on the other side, the let's call them liberals, Pezeshkian as president, Zarif especially as vice president, and the high bourgeoisie of Tehran, which is Atlanticist, essentially. So this is extremely serious. For us foreigners, it's practically impenetrable. So our friends, our connections, of course, they can they tell us a few things and what they know, but they know only part of the story. And of course, the fact that, for instance, there was a running accusation with no evidence, very, very important, that these very well connected, let's say, crypto-Atlanticist, neoliberal, haute bourgeoisie of Tehran circles, they betrayed Hezbollah. They gave coordinates directly to the Israelis to get rid of the Hezbollah leadership. Once again, all of you, there is no evidence about it, but this is something that is openly discussed in Iran, and it went all over the place. It's a taboo discussion, but, it's on. So we don't know how serious it is, this process of undermining the vision of Khamenei, the workings of the IRGC and the Quds Force after Soleimani, the post-Raisi environment, the fact that Pezeshkian is, for all practical purposes, a very weak president, the fact that Zarif, right behind him, has a lot of power in terms of the Atlanticist connections, and how this is going to be resolved in the short to medium term. The resolution of this drama will condition how the axis of resistance is going to be rebuilt. As you said correctly, the Houthis didn't get the message, and they will never get the message because they are the ones with the real cojones in this whole story, and they will continue. They were attacked by Israel. Israel destroyed a power plant in Sana'a. They don't care. They'll keep going. Hezbollah, they will take time to rejuvenate, rebuild, find a different supply line bypassing Syria. They can do it, but this is going to take time and a lot of effort. And of course, Iraq, because Iraq is also an extremely complex situation. The government, essentially, which I visited the government a few months ago when I was in Baghdad. We had an audience with the prime minister. And I talked a lot with some advisors to the prime minister. And they are, most of them, pro-West. we didn't talk much about Russia and China. They were talking about US and Europe all the time. So you can see who's around the prime minister of Iraq. And of course, when we try to meet the people from Hashd al-Shabi, they didn't exactly help us. On the contrary, it's like if we were a small group of foreign visitors, but it was a bit hard for us to actually meet the Hashd al-Shabi people physically. And at one time, we were in the same city. Okay, outside, because it was during the pilgrimage, and we were in near Karbala, but separated by 10 kilometers or so. And these 10 kilometers in terms of a pilgrimage in Karbala will take 1 day for us to to cross everything to meet them. But the vision of the axis of resistance of the government in Baghdad is very different from the vision of Hashd al-Shabi, Kataib Hezbollah, and all the people mobilization units, which are part of the axis of resistance. So this is the Iraqi riddle, extremely complex as well. So it depends on what's going to happen in Iraq. It depends on what's going to happen in Iran. And then we can start talking about the rebuilding of the axis of resistance. And of course, this process with Hezbollah is going to take a long time. So for the moment, the axis of resistance is fragmented and highly fragmented. But this is going to last, let's say, a few months, not more than that. And we can have throughout, by the second semester of 2025, a completely different setup. You see, that's why I like you mentioned, I wrote not so fast. For the moment, there's no question. They had a series of huge blows, serious blows. But never underestimate, when you meet them in person, Danny, when you meet Hezbollah cadres, high level, when you meet people from the IRGC, when you meet people from Hashd al-Shabi, it takes years. In my case, for instance, it took many years. But then, finally, when you have in mind not only the geopolitical game, but also the people involved on a face-to-face level, then you start trusting them and you start to see how valuable and how strong they are. So never underestimate them, never. But let's say straightforward answer to your question, it all depends on this power play in Tehran. This is the key issue. And it's kept under wraps. For us foreigners, once again, it's practically impenetrable. Even if we go there, which I plan to go to Iran as soon as possible. But Khamenei, he never minces his words, and he's a very fine strategist, as you know. He said, basically, this is what he said, look, for the moments like that, it's very hard, but don't underestimate the axis of resistance. This is essentially what he's been saying. And obviously, he's better informed than anybody in Iran. No exception. So we should trust him.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this, Pepe, is that the situation, it seems right now, is that many people believe, just looking at this, including the United States, we hear what they're saying in these think tanks and, Blinken talking to the Council on Foreign Relations. The narrative is that the axis of resistance, all of the Iranian quote-unquote proxies are basically muted now, and that it's almost full steam ahead for the agents of chaos, the empire. But Syria appears to be a potential, and you've talked about this in your articles, and maybe you can get into it, an agent of chaos now itself, where you have all of these various forces that will be vying for power, both the armed groups as well as the states, Israel, Turkey, US, they're all looking for their own piece of Syria. Now, how does this impact Iran then, the axis of resistance? Because many people believe that, well, it's full throttle ahead toward Iran to do the same to Iran. Do you find that to be more possible now, or do you find that this quagmire in Syria may cause more problems than maybe we're being led to believe right now for the empire?
Well, it's wishful thinking mixed with an obsession that comes from the 90s, at least, no? If not from the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, but the obsession is there. The Holy Grail is regime change in Tehran. This will never change. We have these ups and downs. For instance, we can have an Iranian nuclear deal that we had almost 10 years ago, but that obviously didn't solve anything, on the contrary. And don't forget that under Trump was maximum pressure over Iran. So maximum pressure will return on Trump 2.0, obviously. And now with the Zionists emboldened by capturing Syria for them, among others. So basically Syria now, the partition of Syria is US, Israel, and Turkey, essentially. That's it. It's already ongoing. It's very savage. We still don't know the border lines. It's fluid, but these are the three main players. So obviously Tehran looks at that and says, oops, we have to reorganize. And that's what they will do. The obsession by the genocidals in Tel Aviv to have the US fight their war against Iran will be even increased now with and the Trump-Netanyahu relationship, of course. So from an Iranian point of view, they are very, of course, the Persians are always very realist. They are good negotiators. They think long-term. They are realist. They are calm and calculating. A lot of... okay, I prefer not to define them, especially all across the net are saying, it's a bunch of cowards. They're never going to respond to Israel, attacking Israel again. It's not how the Persians think. If you say that, you are an absolute idiot who's never been to Iran. So they're going to take that, they're going to bide their time. If they respond to the latest Israeli attack, is going to be very measured, especially under a Trump administration, or they may choose not to do anything and respond asymmetrically, which is something that they are very, very good at, especially now that they are reorganizing the whole configuration of the axis of resistance without taking Syria into account. This is a very complex process. So at the moment, it's, okay, we retract, we reorganize, we restudy the whole chessboard, and then we're back later. And obviously conducting all that will be Khamenei. And facing resistance by his own government. So that's coming back to the key problem, with a weak president, but with some very, very powerful interests behind. And this high bourgeoisie in North Tehran, especially, these people have a lot of power, a lot of connections, a lot of money. They are all over Europe and the US. So it's a dangerous adversary. And obviously for them is regime change. It's like they were a bunch of Zionists in Washington. It's the same thing. They want regime change as well. So we have these as allies. The Washington gang and the North Tehran gang. And obviously, Khamenei and the RGC, they look around, they say, wow, now we have a huge domestic problem. So we have to solve first our domestic problem, then we're going to start thinking about rebuilding the axis of resistance. Priorities, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a very astute analysis. And one of the final questions I had for you, Pepe, was about some of these dynamics that we're seeing that are very interesting given the collapse of Syria. One, you have, as you have mentioned in the past, Russia talking very forthrightly and openly with the so-called new government in Syria, made up of head-chopping terrorists, but doing so with what seems to be relative ease and not facing the kind of problems that we had assumed almost immediately they would face, which is maybe a forced ouster out of the country.
Yes.
And Iran, too, given Khomeini's comments, I guess my final question to you, he has also made known that Iran is in communication with the new regime, and there also hasn't been a lot of talk about, well, are these forces turning toward Iran? And there's also confidence that Iran will still be able to assist Hezbollah. What do you make of these kind of claims and these dynamics that you see?
It's not claims, Danny. It's part of the secret deals. Well, everything harks back to the pre-fall of Damascus secret deals. And none of us have access to that. And not even diplomats have access to that. And like I mentioned to you before, even Lavrov didn't know in practical terms. So this is really, really serious. It's really at the top of the pops, literally. You know, I wonder on the Iranian side who was negotiating that. It was not Arakshi. No way. It was not Arakshi. It was probably somebody high up at the IRGC, directly connected to Khamenei, the Iranian negotiator in all these conversations. Pezeshkian is too weak for that. And Pezeshkian, he's lousy in foreign policy. He doesn't know anything about foreign policy, really. So that's what makes it so challenging, so intriguing, and at the same time, fraught with dangers. What's ahead? And of course, interfering with all that is Western wishful thinking. No? Now that we got Syria, it's just a short hop to get Tehran. This will never change. But look, they thought that they could inflict a strategic defeat to a hypersonic and nuclear power. Look where they are now. That's it. I rest my case.
Well, Pepe, it was great to be with you today to get you before the new year. So everyone, go to the video description. We have plenty of show left for you, but go to the video description, find Pepe's new articles as well as his Telegram. Pepe, thanks so much, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you, Danny. Thanks, all of you. This is our last conversation of the year, no? Right?
Yeah.
So
I'll be
have a great holiday season, everybody. And get ready, because when we're back in early January,